presenter is our faculty advisor, Mr. Robert Coben. Mr. Coben has been instrumental in everything STEP for the past 3 years, and of course, including this conference. But beyond STEP, Mr. Coben has been an upper school history teacher for the past 18 years. He's spent 11 of those 18 years at Carey Academy, where he has developed a cross-curricular blended learning class in a unique teaching style of theoretical modeling. He is currently working towards his PhD in curriculum and instruction, focusing on modeling and threshold concepts. We are thrilled to welcome Mr. Coben to present and explain this unique and innovative visual learning tool.
I'm going to be using my notes in particular because some of the things that Dr. Lee spoke about, I think I can reflect on. I want to start by just talking a little bit about this evolving pedagogy, which is modeling, and the kind of emerging idea of threshold concepts. And I want to say, first of all, that this seems to reflect very well on the C3, that is the inquiry arc and the notion of disciplinary literacy. So, we'll move on to the problem. The problem, as I see it, is that there's always been a kind of pattern, a rush toward quantity of information over quality of learning, that the focus has been way too much on content and not enough on concept and skills. And I think this has made students' lives rather harried as they kind of rush from test to test trying to find the right answers. And there's been less focus on finding what I think are more important, the right questions. Education can provide information, there's no doubt. You do need content. It can impart, but it can also transform. And I think that's the key here, is finding a way of having transformative education for kids. So why is there a problem? Well, the first reason, I think, is simply a product of our modern life, the blessings and perhaps curses of the internet and technology, which is that we now have access to an incredible amount of information, almost infinite information. And that information overload can lead to, among other things, confusion. It's an indiscriminate flood of information. And I think that means that students are unable to discern any real meaning because of this just inundation, this flood. The data is taken in for a test and usually quickly forgotten thereafter. And I think we need to get away from that sort of pattern, because what it does is reinforce misconceptions. We tend to seek the simple story, the unified singular explanation, a kind of binary world of it's either good or it's bad, and that there's always one cause for every major event, like the Civil War, as you just saw. And as a result, students are left trapped in this level of unchallenged misconceptions. The solution, as I see it, is twofold. First of all, to teach concepts. And again, content is necessary, but it's subordinate to the concept. You need the content in order to develop the concept, but it still has to be the thing you use, not the thing that drives the whole program. And secondly, I think you need to make use of constructivism. The students need to create their own meaning. The students have to come to the understandings on their own. It can't be delivered to them. And this too reflects on what Dr. Lee was talking about, this inquiry arc and disciplinary literacy that students need to learn. And I think for this, threshold concepts seem to be a wonderful goal for students. And these threshold concepts, as you see, are transformative, permanent, deep, and transferable. And they're what experts have. That's what expertise is. It's those people that have these threshold concepts within their discipline and intuitively understand what it's about. And it comes only through a great deal of training and experience, which we can begin in school. And I think in this way, threshold concepts are really dealing with those compelling questions that Dr. Lee referred to. One thing I use as a kind of analogy for threshold concepts is that having the lack of threshold concepts is like being in Plato's cave. This is a drawing, essentially, of Plato's allegory of the cave. That the figures on the wall that are cast by these shapes are seen as reality, are seen as the truth, but they're only misconceptions. In some ways deceptions, in some ways perception problems, but ultimately they're misconceptions. And people stay anchored to them, as these people are anchored to the floor, looking straight ahead at these moving figures. And it's only with great difficulty, through rigorous, challenging questions, and the pursuit of these threshold concepts, that you can get out into the light. And once you get out into the light, you begin to realize that it has become a transformative experience, that these threshold concepts have changed the way you look at the world. It's a radically new view. It overturns the status quo, and it destroys all those misconceptions. And I use this example, this is New York City, Manhattan, as it was, we think, in its natural form, and as it is now with a modern skyline. It is virtually impossible to go to New York City now and imagine what's on the left. We understand the city this way. That is the transformation we have gone through in our understanding of what that landscape looks like. And once you have seen this threshold concept, you can't unsee it. You all recognize this rabbit-duck optical illusion. And once you see the rabbit and once you see the duck, you can't unsee the rabbit or the duck. It's there. You won't return to those prior misconceptions as a result. And the understanding that comes through threshold concepts is deep. It's sophisticated, it's nuanced, it's complex. It's actually the solution to what was shown in that Simpsons clip of this kind of very simplified version of, in this case, the causes of the Civil War. There is no single answer, but there are lots of questions. And those threshold concepts allow us to get an understanding that is transferable, can be used within other cases in the same discipline. Once you understand a threshold concept in history, you can apply it to other cases in history. But more importantly, I think, you can apply it to other disciplines. So this really reflects the multidisciplinary, or perhaps even non-disciplinary nature of the world. People don't work in a society in which you do history, and then 3 hours later you do math. That's not the way it actually works. You do history, math, English, all those things at once as they're required. And that's, I think, mirrored in this notion of threshold concepts, these adaptations, as Dr. Lee would put it. So I wanted to talk about threshold concepts as they appear in history. And before I do that, let me just explain where both modeling and threshold concepts come from. Both come from the sciences. It is not something that the humanities latched onto initially. And I can tell you that just a little bit of quick institutional history, Dr. Greenwolf, who's sitting back there, has been doing modeling in physics for many years here at Curie Academy. And Carol Hamilton, who's an English teacher, colleague of mine, and I went to see a couple of his classes and saw the modeling he was doing and realized that this would be a great approach to use in our disciplines, in the humanities. So it is an adoption and adaptation of modeling. It isn't the same modeling as what's used in the sciences. in part because unlike the sciences, there are no fixed laws in history. We find them developing organically. As the students look into do an analysis, they come up with more and more of these concepts. They develop them themselves. And I just wanted to provide some examples of these kinds of threshold concepts. This is, again, certainly not the limit of them. First one I want to mention is that history is marked by cycles. And there are often cycles within cycles. In other words, as you reach one of these stages, it too goes through the cycle. Just to give you a couple of examples to illustrate. Markets, as in the stock market, which I don't want to talk about today, because things aren't going all that well, but that is one of those cycles, the ebb and flow, the ups and downs, the boom and bust cycle within economics. More directly, I think, is the case of national development, like the development of the United States. We have a moment of creation. You could say that it's when the Europeans come to North America. Again, these are all arguable, but you could say that that's when it occurs. That there's a formation period, which might be the Revolution and perhaps even the Declaration of Independence. Then you move on to the Constitutional period and organization. Growth is the 19th century. And then you move into maturation, which is, I think, where we are now. Choose to believe that we're not in decline. And then even in decline, you're simply returning to yet another creation stage. It doesn't end, it just changes. History, too, is contextual. Historians create history in a context. It's inflected, it's filtered, it's based on who they are, where they are, and when they are. And all those variables change the way we see history. Events, when the event is taking place, certain records are created, but not all records. We don't have a complete picture of any historical event because only certain things were written down. Imagine you were making a diary entry or journal entry for your own life. You're not going to write down every single detail of your life, although these days we're starting to get that. And then secondly, you're going to have an interpreter, that is the historian in this case, who's going to look at this selective body of material and make their interpretations, again, based on their context. And then thirdly, you're going to have the reader, the viewer, who from their perspective is going to be looking at the historian's perspective on the perspective that was taken at the time of the event. So now you have kind of third-hand history. So you can see all the opportunities for change in interpretation that are involved in history. And one quick example is the one I'm showing you, which is the northern version of Abraham Lincoln on the left, our sainted martyr in a temple on a throne. And on the bottom right was a cartoon from the period of the Civil War, a southern cartoon, in which he's shown rather as an oppressive dictator, trampling over the Constitution of the United States. So again, context matters. We tend to, as I said before, overly simplify complex causes and effects. History is not predetermined. It didn't happen this way because it was meant to happen this way. And we tend to, since we're looking in reverse, we tend to look at those things that occurred as having been necessary, as having been sort of obvious. Well, it wasn't obvious to the people living then. Just as one example that's often given, in World War II, the Americans didn't know that they were going to win the war ultimately. There was a great deal of question as to whether or not we could win that war. And that changes the way we interpret those events in World War II. Those events did not occur because we had a planned ending. Okay? We sometimes mistake coincidence for cause. One example of that is the stock market crash of 1929. The stock market crash did not cause the Great Depression. It is a symptom of the Great Depression. It was coincident with the Great Depression. It may have exacerbated it, but it in itself was not the cause. And again, we have the examples that Dr. Lee gave about the causes of the Civil War, as opposed to, as it's often called, the cause. The other thing, another concept, threshold concept in history, is the notion that conflict is inevitable, that there are opposing forces that are rarely, if ever, in true equilibrium. Nothing stays the same. And because of this imbalance, you have the dynamism that is history. The constant change as a result of these forces in a kind of perpetual tug of war between exclusion, inclusion, control, and rebellion, resistance. Okay? And what happens is it's often the case that, for instance, repression brings revolution, which brings repression, which brings revolution, and so on and so forth, as the pendulum swings back and forth as the tension increases. Another of these sort of binary tensions is this movement from fragmentation to consolidation. You can see where power, money, people, all kinds of things have at times been brought together and at times dispersed. For example, when we moved from rural villages to cities, and then from cities to outer suburbs and exurbia, and then back to cities, we're seeing that same pattern of fragmentation, consolidation, etc. You can see it in whole industries. When the technology industry was first around, you had small businesses, small entities who were creating this innovative technology. Now you have huge concerns, essentially an oligopoly that has developed within technology. And then finally, among these examples, I have this one, which is that societies tend to define themselves not by themselves, but by the other, by what they're not, in contrast to something or someone else. And it's this focus on the difference that can create great tensions in history. One obvious example is eugenics. Eugenics is the notion that you can create a better self by defining what that better self is and excluding those things that are inferior. Unfortunately and notoriously, this resulted in some rather objectionable, offensive policies in order to create eugenics. And yes, ultimately, I would say that creating an other demonizes those people and forms the groundwork for racism or all kinds of discrimination. Okay, at the moment I just want to take a pause, give you guys a chance to think about threshold concepts. So if you would turn to a neighbor and figure out what in your discipline or lives would be what you consider to be a threshold concept, these kinds of seminal ideas. And I'm sure one of the things you're noticing is that it is really very difficult to come up with what those threshold concepts might be. And that, I think, is a good thing. I think that's what makes learning fresh, is because there is room for further development of what these concepts might even be. I want to make the transition now from threshold concepts to what I think is a great way of getting to them, and that is through modeling. And I've put up on this slide a series of before and after for modeling, what I think it provides, what the attributes are of learning before and learning after. That before you can focus, your focus is on the product, the end. And after, through modeling, the focus becomes on process, how you get there, how you acquire. Before, you're looking for the right answer. After, you're asking the right questions. Before, you're consuming data. After, you're constructing meaning. Before is teacher-centered. After is student-centered. Before relies on short-term memory. After promotes long-term understanding. Before, you're simply repeating the old. And in the after, you're discovering the new. And this is what sort of abstractly modeling looks like. You might think of this as one model of modeling. And you can also see here the difference between humanities and sciences. On the right, you see laws and rules. Those things don't really exist in historical study. But what you can do, and what is similar to modeling in the sciences, is derive these models through reflection, discussion, experimentation, examples. And so let me show you how that kind of works. Because in modeling instruction, what you're dealing with is not rote content. It's not something you simply memorize. It is all about constructing meaning and doing that through analysis. And because of that, students are actively engaged, even more so than you would see on this diagram. I would say that it's even below, I don't know why they put it on the bottom, but it's even below the most active. I think this is, in other words, authentic instruction. And the more engaged a student is, simply the better they understand and also remember. So this is one version of what happens in a modeling exercise. They collect data, they analyze the content, they construct a model, they share the results, they discuss and evaluate those models, looking for certain qualities, whether or not it's a predictive model, whether or not it explains, and whether or not it's transferable to different scales, to different situations, different contexts. This is another version of the same thing, which is the recursive nature of modeling. You begin with a problem, you go through the data, analysis, construction, you find the theme, you discuss the context, you do your analysis, you build the model, you present it to the group, the larger group, and then you discuss all the models within that group. And then you reflect on it as an individual to what you've learned. What is the seminal lesson? What is the concept, the threshold concept that is under study here? And through this recursive scholarship, you come to new understandings. This is one example of a model. This is a prompt, essentially, for a model. This is John Gast's painting, American Progress, which I believe was actually a mural in the AT&T building in New York City. And Columbia, that's an allegorical figure of Columbia, is flying over the west, and she's unreeling telegraph wire from her hand. And the question then becomes, what does this rhetoric, this visual rhetoric, say about expansion? What is this that's happening in this particular case, which is manifest destiny, which also applies in other places and other times? So here are students engaged in the actual practice of constructing a model. They work in teams of 3. And while they're working, the teacher walks around and talks to them in what I call Socratic hovering. where we sort of ask them questions, prod them, in order to get them to focus more on the concept than on perhaps the content itself. And in essence, this is a formative assessment. In practice, they learn to discuss with themselves within the group and defend their theory, their concept of what is the underlying pattern that's seen in the data, seen in the case study. And then they present this to their peers. So there's a presentation, an authentic presentation portion of this, in which they then explain what it is that they were trying to convey, what lesson and concept they uncovered. And as a seminar, they discuss it. And then again, there's an individual reflection after. I'm just going to show you two examples of models. The first one is the Code of Hammurabi, as expressed in mathematical terms. And one thing you should know about models is they're not necessarily correct. But that's not the objective. The objective is not to come, again, to the right answer. It's to come to the right questions. And what they're saying here is that you can apply mathematical rules to a legal code. And then you can look at other legal codes and see whether or not those same mathematical rules might apply and generalize it. This is another example. This is taking it from the specific case to a more generalizable, which in this case is trade relations. And what this shows in the metaphor of an electrical circuit is that economic trade is driven by and drives cultural, intellectual, and social change. And the trip, that is the kind of the fuse, the circuit breaker in this case, is politics. That sometimes the trade itself can be just completely disrupted by a political event. But that otherwise this electricity is providing power for those cultural, intellectual, and social transfers that take place in trade. So what is modeling? Well, it allows students to act as true historians, as authentic historians. They are learning the practice of the discipline. They're learning the habits of mind, the dispositions of a historian rather than simply memorizing material from a secondary source, other people's ideas. They're developing their own. They're developing these through analytical skills. They're learning to interpret evidence and to provide their own meaning and concept. And those skills and concepts can then be transferred, as I said, not only within the discipline of history, but to other disciplines. And other disciplines can come into history as well. There are many times in history when we look at statistical data. And therefore you need to have the skills made available to you through your math course, through your statistics course, while you're interpreting historical information. These models tend to be very provocative, and they promote discussion. They drive a seminar. And because these models are being constructed by the student, they are wholly invested and therefore wholly engaged in the process, and therefore in the result. And the result is they ultimately have a better understanding of the concepts that are these threshold concepts that underlie the discipline of history. So I would just finish up once again repeating that I think the solution to the problem I expressed at the beginning is simply to, well, not simply, but to teach the concepts, focus on concepts, and to do so in a way that is constructivist in nature, that relies on the student to generate the ideas. Thank you.
So since modeling is such a huge part of what we do in STEP, we want to let you guys all try your hand at it. And in accordance with what Mr. Coben was just talking about, how we want to make learning something more active so that we'll actually remember what we're talking about. So it's not just necessarily what you're hearing in the lecture, but you actually want to try your hands at something so that you retain it in your memory a little better. So the way we're going to do this is if you pull out your yellow agendas, on Thursday you should have a room highlighted for modeling in the upper school building. And we're going to actually combine rooms today. So if you're in U105 or U108, it's highlighted in green. You will actually be going into U108. And if you are in U113 or U114, you will be going into U114. And if you're in U125 or U126, you'll be going into U126. And we will have student volunteers helping direct you to the upper school building. It's the building that you walked through to get here, right across the quad. So you're more than welcome to take a break real quick. We'll probably start the session in about 10 minutes, grab some water or a drink, or any of those snacks out there. And thank you so much.